Hello, I'm Sally Holland, and I'm a professor of social work at Cardiff University School of Social Sciences. I'm part of the CASCADE Research Centre. And I'm going to talk today about the recent change of law in Wales, which ended any legal defence to the physical punishment of children. And this is popularly known as the smacking ban. After 20 years or more of campaigning in Wales for this law change, there's now no place or circumstance in Wales in which children can be physically hurt as a punishment for wrongdoing. Specifically, the law ended the legal defence that was previously available to parents and carers regarding the physical punishment of children in the home. That defence was to claim that the punishment was reasonable. Physical punishment, of course, is usually called smacking in the UK, but it does include any other punishment that causes pain as well. Now, in Wales, the law change has been accompanied by a package of measures, including guidance for parents and professionals and what the law change will mean for them, and some alternative routes from prosecution, which will include support and potentially training and education as well. So in this short video, I'm going to talk about some of the ups and downs on the way to changing the law, and I'm going to concentrate on some of the key objections that were raised to changing the law and give my responses to each of them. Here's one example of from the government website of how the campaign has been a fairly major event here in Wales over the last year, with television adverts, leaflets through doors, and a number of websites as well. I first started working on this issue as an academic around about 10 years ago. Where, along with others, I formed a group called Academics for Equal Protection. And we were trying to give additional support to the groups that were already campaigning on this issue by providing research evidence from the fields of social work, education, criminology, psychology, psychiatry, family law, and a number of other areas as well. In 2015, I became the Children's Commissioner for Wales, where my role was for the next 7 years to, as an independent person, to monitor, promote and protect the human rights of children under the United Nations Convention of the Rights of the Child. And of course, this law change was very important to that role, because in my view as Commissioner and in the view of the United Nations, not having this protection in the law for children means that the United Nations Convention is not being fully fulfilled in a nation. I'm really delighted, actually, that the Welsh Government, when they did finally introduce this legal change, they emphasised that they were doing it because of their obligations under the United Nations Convention for the Rights of the Child. It took many years to achieve this law change. A coalition of politicians, campaign groups, third sector groups, faith groups, particularly the Church in Wales and the humanists as well. And me and my team at the Children's Commissioner's Office, we all worked on this relentlessly to try to persuade both elected politicians and the wider community of Wales that this law change was necessary. And the public opinion was actually already changing, which was a real help to persuading politicians that the change needed to happen. And support for the change in the law was particularly high amongst parents who were currently parents of young children. And that's a really important group, because it's young children, particularly toddlers, who are most likely to be smacked by their parents or carers. And those parents are currently living with all the joys, but also exhaustion and sometimes frustrations that can come with parenting young children day in, day out. So the fact that the vast majority of them did not support the physical punishment of children felt like a real game changer in terms of popular opinion. So the main group that we had to persuade was the government in 2015 when I became Children's Commissioner, but also whoever would form the next government in 2016. In 2016, before the election, it wasn't on the government's agenda. It was still just something that was being asked for. But in 2016, as we came up to the election for the Welsh Parliament, or Senedd, and after relentless lobbying by many of the groups I've mentioned already, it was firmly in the manifestos of several key parties. And importantly, it was in Labour's manifesto, as Labour did yet again form the government in 2016, alongside one Liberal Democrat member who was also in favour of the law change. The resulting publishing of plans for this legislation was then met with some really quite vociferous opposition by a relatively small number of elected politicians from the Conservative and UKIP parties, and also by a very small but media-savvy lobby group as well, who were campaigning against this legal change. So now I'm going to talk through some of the top objections that were raised. I'm going to tell you my top 10 of objections that, as Children's Commissioner and the government themselves and lobby groups, etc., had to discuss and counter, really, in debates in the media and in the rationale behind the legislation. So I think one of the top objections that we tend to hear is from adults, that, well, it never did me any harm. And of course, there are many well-balanced and successful adults who were sometimes smacked as children, just as there are some people who live to a ripe old age having smoked 20 cigarettes a day. We know that smoking leads to you being more likely to have a lower life expectancy and also poorer health, but it doesn't mean that that will have the same effect on every individual. Similarly, children who are physically punished are more likely to have poorer outcomes in relation to behaviour and well-being than those who are not physically punished, and therefore trying to reduce the amount of smacking in society is a general public health measure, as well as having many other benefits as well. The second key objective, and these first two are probably the two that we hear the most, is that it's not the business of the state to interfere in family life. People see the punishment of children by parents as something that's very private, something that happens behind closed doors, and something that parents should have full control over. But of course, in advanced societies, the state passes many laws that shape our family life. For example, we must register our children's birth. We must make sure that they have a suitable education. We must make sure that they wear seatbelts in the car. And all of these are designed to make sure that our children grow up safe, happy, and healthy in our society. So we do draw lines as to what's acceptable and not acceptable. And beyond that, parents are free to raise their family within their own beliefs, culture, and style, and very individually as they wish. Objection number 3, another one that's often raised, is that smacking is necessary to ensure good behaviour, particularly amongst younger children. However, it's actually been found not to be necessary when you look at research. In fact, research suggests that the ideal, optimal style of parenting is one that's authoritative, which is consistent, has routines, which has lots of love, has clear boundaries, has positive relationships, and most importantly, has no smacking attached. Those are the optimal conditions for parenting, in which children are most likely to thrive and indeed to behave well as well. The fourth objection very regularly raised, particularly in the passing of this legislation, is that it will criminalise everyday acts of parenting, such as stopping children running onto the road, or putting their hand in the fire, or perhaps hurting a child accidentally when trying to brush their hair or strap them to a car seat. Actually, it's not necessary to smack children, even very young children, to stop them repeating behaviours. In fact, if they're too young to understand reason, then it's our job as adults to keep them safe from the roads and from putting their hands in the fire. And nothing stops us holding children to keep them safe. And this legislation wouldn't lead to prosecutions if someone accidentally hurt their child, perhaps when brushing their hair, and it was very tangled. We would never use the argument, for example, for adults who lack the capacity to understand that it's unsafe to go on a road, perhaps because they've got advanced dementia. We would never use the argument that we should therefore hit them so that they learn the lesson, and we should not do that for children either. Objective number 5 is that it will criminalise large numbers of parents. But there's no evidence of large numbers being prosecuted in the dozens of other nations that have passed this legislation, including some that are very close to our own, like Ireland and Scotland. Prosecutors have to consider what's in the best interests of the child when thinking about considering whether to take forward a prosecution, and also what's in the best interests of the state as well, whether it's worth the state's time to prosecute. The systems in Wales will aim to identify parents who are under stress and give them support as necessary as a first resort. The 6th objection raised is that it discriminates against some social groups, for example, those living in poverty and some from certain faith or ethnic groups. Well, all children, no matter their household income, their race, their religion or gender, have the same rights to protection, and we shouldn't accept any lower standards from children from any particular groups. And in fact, physical punishment is present in households of every income level and every cultural and social background as well. And assuming it is simply related, for example, to poverty, I think simply falls back on lazy stereotypes of certain social groups. Objection number 7. Often raised is that it will be really difficult to enforce. How will we know whether a parent has broken the law? What will happen if they're reported? Well, all human behaviours are really difficult to regulate, and we already have legislation which means that that any form of physical violence between adults, for example, is illegal. And police and others have had to navigate that legislation for many years. And without this legislation, police, social services and health professionals have had to work for years in a completely grey area. They've had to actually have discussions with parents and carers about how hard they can hit their children. Now they'll be able to tell them very clearly that there is no such thing as a light smack or hit, and they'll be able to be much clearer about promoting more positive forms of helping our children learn how to behave well. In Wales, the work around the law change has been developed and supported by the police, social workers, health visitors and faith groups. Objection number 8 is, why would we concentrate on this, particularly in legislation, and not more severe abuse when many children are still being abused or neglected in Wales and worldwide? And I do understand people's concerns on this, but there are already laws regarding more severe abuse. And if we want to live in a violence-free society, we must get our messages straight. What message does it give to young children if we imply that if we want to get someone else to do what we want them to do, or if we're perhaps a bit frustrated or angry with another person, that it's okay to hit or strike them. That is not a good lesson for their entire life and for all of their relationships, whether that's their peer groups or in their intimate relationships as they get older. If we want a violent-free society, we must make sure that no forms of violence are protected in the law. Some people have made the argument, and here we come to objection number 9, that smacking is reducing anyway in society. So why do we need to legislate? Surely there are other things we should be legislating for. And it is great news that smacking is reducing, and it is true that the use of smacking by parents is reducing in Wales and across the United Kingdom. However, when we look at other nations that have passed this legislation, compare them to those that haven't, we found that although smacking tends to be reducing in most nations around the world, it has accelerated it by passing legislation, and particularly when accompanied by the kind of education and publicity campaigns that we've had in Wales. So the good news is that by passing this legislation, we should be accelerating those changes that we are already seeing in society. The final objection raised was a slightly unusual one, and this was raised by one of our members of the Welsh Parliament, one of our Senedd members, during the debates about the legislation, saying that it might deter visitors from coming to Wales. Well, many popular holiday spots, including Spain, which is particularly popular with people from Britain to travel to, have passed this law, and it has certainly not reduced or ended tourism there. In fact, I think that a nation that protects all its citizens and visitors from physical violence should make it a more attractive place to both live and visit. So what difference will this legislative change make for Wales? Well, importantly for me, having just finished my tenure as Children's Commissioner, is that it brings us in line internationally with most of Europe and many other nations around the world. Before that, we were real outliers. It makes us compliant, or more compliant, with the United Nations Convention for the Rights of the Child. It gives our children the message that they have the right to protection from violence in every place that they are in Wales. It ensures that our health visitors, social workers, police officers and education staff can give clearer advice to parents, non-ambiguous advice. And in the long run, it should improve our population health by making it increasingly rare for children to be smacked or hit at home. I'm now back. I finished my stint as Children's Commissioner, and I'm back in Cardiff University, and I'll be keeping a close eye on the implementation of this law, and I hope you all will too. Diolch yn fawr am wrando. Thank you very much for listening.